Welcome back to the ReBT Advocates with Dr. Michael R. Adelstein and Tommy Bateman. The ReBT Advocates are those therapists that advocate for a more effective therapy. We bring expertise and experience to you so that you yourself may improve. Whether you are a therapist or not, this stuff works. Please subscribe to this show. We upload new content every week and have access to the best ReBT therapists available. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at rebtadvocates@gmail.com. It's been a week since we put out mistakes ReBT therapists make. Now for part 2. Let's get started. All right. So one of the biggest issues I have, and something, being closer to grad school and having been inundated with a bunch of different counseling theories, one of the biggest mistakes I make, and I think ReBT therapists make, is that they go beyond what ReBT requires. They kind of complicate it beyond what it needs to be. For example, when discussing an issue, a client that has, family issues, they want to focus on the family issue and solving the family issue and not focusing on really what the real problem is, such as, well, this person can't stand having a family system that's not working. That's what the real disturbance is. It's not that the family system isn't working, and maybe we can work on that, in a non-ReBT fashion, or maybe they should be referred to a family therapist. But in this case, the client is disturbed not by the family system, because that's the A. They're disturbed by their belief about the family system. So getting lost in, structural family therapy or any other family systems therapy distracts from the original goal that the client had. And I think that's a mistake we ReBT therapists trained in other therapies can get distracted in doing. I first started with, Rogerian style, person-centered, and as well as structural family therapy was the first thing I was trained on. And when I encounter clients that have family systems issues, sometimes I want to get lost in that, but that's not what they're there for. So I need to avoid getting into that sort of situation. For example, I see people that are often separated from their families because of incarceration. So they come to me and they want to talk about how their girlfriend is cheating on them. And I tell them, well, we can't control what's going on the outside of this jail. You can only control you. And he says, well, I'm mad about it. I need to find a solution. What should I tell her, or how should I act? And I go, I know you're mad about it. That's the problem. And you want to be not mad about it. And they said, yeah, that's the whole point of this. Well, then let's work about the anger, not and the anxiety and the stress about the situation, not necessarily the fact that she's doing something that's completely out of your control. Let's control you, which is your beliefs, which will lead to a better consequence.
Oh, very good. And what would, if the therapist in this case was making the mistake you referred to, how would they proceed in this situation?
Well, I'll tell you what I did, because I've made these mistakes. I would go, well, this is information for, let's just use the example I used for dealing with healthy boundaries. Here's some relationship stuff and some systems therapy, but that's not what we're here for. And I kind of catch myself. I usually then offer them reading material on that, basic thing, but then say, but this you can read on your own. What we're here for is to work on your emotional disturbance, not the family system that you're having an issue with, or the relationship issue. Here's some information if you want it. If not, we're really here to work on you and your emotional disturbance.
I would like to address the idea that when a client brings up a problem, the therapist, rather than focusing on the irrational beliefs that are causing the problem, the therapist focuses on what they call where it came from, the client's childhood experiences, dysfunctional family, critical mother and absent father, those kinds of things, and claims that, well, let's find out why you feel this way, and the why is something that happened in the client's upbringing, which, as we know, that's not the case. That's been disproved over and over again with identical twin studies and other kinds of research. For example, I might have a client who says that the reason they're so sensitive to criticism is because growing up, their parents criticized them a lot.
Mm.
And then I might have another client who says the reason I'm so sensitive to criticism is because growing up I had a loving family. They never criticized me. I never learned how to deal with criticism. So it's the kind of idea that if it was in your childhood, that caused it. If it wasn't in your childhood, that caused it. It's not, first of all, it's not falsifiable. And secondly, if it's in your childhood, there's nothing you can do about it except invent a time machine and go back to your past. The main thing you can work on is your thinking about that now and changing your irrational thinking.
And I like that, because what you're differentiating is between, it doesn't matter why you have the thought, it's that you have that irrational belief, right?
Yes, and if a client wants to know why they have the thought, I usually tell them, well, there are a few reasons. One is because all humans are genetically predisposed to escalate our strong preferences into demands, into musts and shoulds, such as, because I prefer not to be criticized, therefore I absolutely must never be criticized, and if I am criticized, this proves I'm a no-good loser. So that's one reason why people have these thoughts. It's a genetic tendency and predisposition that just about all of us have. And then the other reason we have this thought, and deeply enough to feel it and act on it, is because we tend to reinforce this idea when we're criticized, and at other times, I need my wife's approval or my husband's approval or my mother's or my kids' approval, and because they're criticizing me, I'm no good. And then they reinforce that thinking again, 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 consciously and unconsciously, and that keeps it alive and maintains it.
When it comes to ReBT, are these whys, the reasons you give, such as the genetic example, are they even useful for the ReBT framework, or is it something that can be taken or left?
Well, it is useful if, in some cases, for example, if someone has a secondary disturbance, I shouldn't be thinking this way, I shouldn't be so irrational and need people's approval, when obviously I don't need people's approval. And then if you show them, well, one of the reasons is because of your genetic predispositions, because you're human, you have a tendency to think this way, then they're less likely to blame themselves personally for having this thought and be more accepting of it. So that would be one use of it. And another is if someone just is curious and has a thirst for knowing where these things come from, then we can give them that information, and that could, to some extent, satisfy that.
In my experience, too, when dealing with substance use, oftentimes I go over the biology of addiction, how it works, when you are physically dependent, when that ends, and what that looks like on a cellular level. And though when it comes to the actions of getting over, moving beyond and getting into recovery, it's really irrelevant when it comes to taking the actions and changing the thought patterns needed. But it does seem to help them relax and have that understanding, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. And as a cautionary note, I normally don't go into these things, the biochemical background or the genetic background, unless I'm asked, because I notice that some therapists will go over a long explanation with diagrams of the brain and where these thoughts come from, the prefrontal cortex and things like that, when the client never asked and is not particularly interested. So it's good to keep an eye on that the client is interested and asks about it.
Excellent. And, all right.
Okay.
So, all right, I have one as well, and this one's a little bit shorter. I don't know if I have any specific example about it, but one of the mistakes ReBT therapists make is not being more familiar with ReBT literature. Now, we are introduced to it almost as a footnote sometimes, at least that was my experience in graduate school, was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, was developed by, and they talk about Dr. Ellis and they talk about the other behavioral therapists. and they kind of mentioned ReBT as an aside. My introduction to ReBT wasn't through anything Dr. Ellis wrote. It was actually on a website that I think you're very familiar with, the ReBT Network. And by the way, if anybody is curious about it, it's rebtnetwork.com. I don't think it's been updated in a while, but the information on there is still good. It's still up there. I think, Michael, you have something on there as well. So there's still very rich information there for folks to peruse. But that was my introduction to it. It wasn't a guide to rational therapy or anything that Dr. Ellis did. However, I think any serious ReBT therapist needs to get very familiar with the language, because, well, I mean, oftentimes I've been caught by you too, Michael, that I'm using language and concepts that aren't quite in line. Maybe I'm getting too close to the point, but it doesn't really encapsulate the philosophy of ReBT. And if I were more familiar with the literature than I am today, that would necessarily improve. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's the important point, not only for therapists, but also for their clients. Mm-hmm. If their clients are interested, that's a homework assignment I normally give to my clients starting at the end of the first session, if they're interested in reading, and normally they are. And if they're not, then I suggest, or even along with it, I suggest YouTubes and podcasts. Albert Ellis has many podcasts. Mm-hmm. As I do, and other ReBT therapists, about ReBT and the theory of ReBT. So it's useful to have some understanding of the theory, and especially by the therapist. And Albert Ellis has written over 80 books mm-hmm. on ReBT from every perspective under the sun. So the more books you can read by Albert Ellis would be great. I wrote a few books. The main one is 3-Minute Therapy, Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life. Mm-hmm. A lot of therapists have liked that and gave it to their clients also. So I think that's important in terms of understanding ReBT and the underpinnings of it, which will help you be a better therapist in terms of applying it.
One of the great things about ReBT is you don't have to be a trained psychotherapist, counselor, social worker, physician. You can pick up these books, learn the philosophy, and learn the techniques, and do it yourself. And that's not irresponsible to do. Of course, find a mentor in the form of a counselor or a psychologist to help guide the way and help fill in the blanks. But this is information you can take and run with. Anybody can.
Yes, that's a great point. And also in your self-training, you could do it on yourself, which is very important, and write out the 3-minute exercises, the ABCs, and you can practice it on friends. So when I train therapists who don't have degrees and don't have a practice, I tell them to corner a friend and say, I'd like to practice my therapy techniques, and why don't you tell me about a problem and I'll try to help you with it. And then they record that and play that to me, and I give them feedback on it. So certainly you can teach other people ReBT, and it's really an educational approach mm-hmm. rather than a medical or therapy approach to helping oneself and others to problems. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Excellent. And by the way, we've also already mentioned that we need to be doing our own 3-minute therapies in the morning. I've started doing that, Michael. It's fantastic. Thank you for recommending it.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, so another mistake therapists tend to make is conflating practical problems with emotional problems. Mm. So, for example, someone will come in and say, boy, am I angry. I was just cut off when I was driving, and I chased the guy down, blew my horn, and wonder if you can help me. Now, the client has just expressed both a practical problem and an emotional problem, and the problem separation technique says identify the emotional problem, if there is one, and identify the practical problem, and then usually start by getting to work on the emotional problem. So in this example, a therapist who falls into this trap might say, well, when someone cuts you off, first of all, don't drive so close to the guy in front of you. So if someone wants to get in front of you, they don't have to cut you off. They can ease their way in. And also try to understand that people, not all people, drive well. Expect that to happen. Count to 10. So they might give you practical solutions and to try to solve the emotional problem. The emotional problem here is road rage. So if an ReBT therapist would say, well, let's start with your emotional problem. You were angry. Let's look at what you were telling yourself about this reckless driver rather than the reckless driver itself that made you angry, and identify that the driver shouldn't endanger my life, and question, challenge, and contradict that first to work on the emotional problem, and then often the practical problem will solve itself. But if it doesn't, then you can learn some practical driving strategies. Another example, a common example, if you work with couples, is a couple will come in and they'll be arguing and bickering. If you use a problem separation technique, you could identify the practical problem as poor communication skills, and the emotional problem, if there is one, anger, resentment, hurt about the poor communication. So rather than just jumping in and teaching them communication skills to try to help them with both, it's often more useful to identify each and then help them with their anger and resentment philosophically in terms of their conditions that lead to that. And then when they try to implement better communication skills, they're less likely to get angry while they're doing that. So the anger won't sabotage the skills training.
Oh, man, that's such a good one. And I'm shaking my head and smiling. I know you can't see it, but because that's a mistake I make. I'm so tempted to make all the time because, don't follow the guy so close when you're driving. You ever heard the parable of the doctor? The patient comes in and says, well, my knee hurts when I move it like this. Well, the doctor says, well, don't move it like that.
Yeah, very good. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And
it's so tempting to do that.
Yeah, it is. And if the doctor is a good ReBT therapist, the doctor would say, and how do you feel emotionally about that? Mm-hmm. So if the patient says, well, I'm concerned and it's frustrating, and that's it, then maybe don't move it like that, or some exercises would be appropriate. But if the patient says, well, I get very depressed and worry that I won't be able to walk and for the rest of my life, then there's an emotional problem to work on as well. So one of the ways you can address this is by teaching your client the problem separation technique in the abstract, and then show them how to apply it to their particular problem. Was there an emotional problem? And an emotional problem doesn't mean emotions or even strong emotions. An emotional problem means disturbed emotions, dysfunctional emotions, emotions that are eating you up inside and leading to poor results. That's an emotional problem. And then was there a practical problem? And then if both are identified, which would you like to start with? Often a client will say, I don't know. And then I say, well, then in that case, it's usually more effective to start with the emotional problem.
That's why they call you the master, Michael. That's awesome. Thank you for all that. Thanks
so much, Tommy.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening this far. That's going to do it for today. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at rebtadvocates@gmail.com. Again, that's rebtadvocates@gmail.com. And please subscribe to the channel. We have a ton of content coming. All right, bye now.